The story begins in a place where no one expected tragedy, a small coastal town, known more for its picturesque cafes and quiet harbor than for scandal or violence. Life here moved at a slower pace. Residents knew each other, rumors traveled fast, and everyone thought they understood the hidden rules of their community. But one case would unravel those assumptions, exposing how influence, money, and power can mask danger. Her name was Clara Dubois, a young woman of just 23. She was bright, ambitious, and filled with a restless energy that drew people to her. She had grown up in an ordinary family. Her father a mechanic, her mother a nurse. They had raised her with traditional values, stressing hard work, respect, and resilience. Clara was their pride, a daughter who balanced responsibility with dreams that stretched beyond the town's borders. In her teenage years, Clara stood out not just for her striking looks but for her voice. She sang in the school choir, performed at small festivals, and spoke often of one day moving to the city to pursue music or perhaps journalism. But her ambitions required money, and like many young women in small towns, she began working early. By the time she was 20, she was waitressing at a popular restaurant by the marina, a place where locals mingled with wealthier visitors. It was there she met Henri LaSalle. Henri was not like the young men who usually tried to court her. He was older, by more than 20 years. At 45, he was already an established figure in the region, a businessman with holdings in real estate, luxury rentals, and a small but profitable vineyard. Henri's name carried weight. People spoke of him with a mix of respect and suspicion. He was known for generosity in public, donating to local festivals, supporting town renovations, but also for arrogance in private. Clara first encountered him when he came in for dinner with a group of investors. He wore a tailored suit, spoke confidently, and left a tip that exceeded her weekly wages. He noticed her too. Over the following weeks, Henri returned more frequently, sometimes alone. He asked for her by name, requested her section, and lingered after meals to make small talk. His interest was clear. At first, Clara saw him as nothing more than a generous customer, perhaps even a mentor. But Henri was persistent. He invited her to exclusive dinners, introduced her to people far outside her usual circle, and lavished her with expensive gifts, perfume, jewelry, even designer clothes. For her friends, it was obvious he was pursuing her. Some warned her about the dangers of getting involved with a man so much older, richer, and more powerful. But Clara resisted the label of relationship. She insisted they were simply friends, that Henri admired her potential and wanted to help. Yet, as time passed, the boundaries blurred. Henri began showing up at her workplace more frequently, waiting outside after her shifts, offering to drive her home. He framed his attention as protection, telling her it was unsafe for a young woman to walk alone at night. Soon, he convinced her to leave her small apartment and move into a flat he owned, rent-free. He argued it would help her save money, give her space, and put her closer to opportunities. Her parents were uneasy. Clara's father especially distrusted Henri, seeing in him not just a wealthy benefactor, but a man exerting control. He warned Clara, "Be careful. People like him don't give without expecting something in return." But Clara pushed back. To her, Henri was offering what no one else could, a chance to escape the small-town cycle, a chance to be part of something bigger. By 2020, Clara and Henri were widely seen together, at upscale restaurants, charity events, and local galas. He introduced her as his companion, sometimes even as his fiancée, though Clara never used that word herself. In public, Henri was charming, protective, and proud of her. But behind closed doors, the story was different. The shift. Clara confided in friends that Henri had a temper. Small disagreements could trigger sudden outbursts. If she ignored one of his calls, he accused her of disrespect. If she spent too much time with girlfriends, he demanded to know where she was, what she was doing, and why she wasn't with him. His wealth became another form of control. The gifts that once felt generous began to feel like chains. He reminded her often of what he had done for her, of the apartment she lived in, the opportunities he provided. "Without me," he would say, "you'd still be waiting tables." Clara tried to pull away, but Henri's influence was suffocating. He was deeply connected in the community, friends with police officials, business leaders, even local politicians. People described him as untouchable. If Clara wanted to break free, she would have to do so quietly, carefully. But Henri seemed to sense her growing distance. His behavior shifted from controlling to threatening. He reminded her that he could ruin her reputation, that without his support she would lose her apartment, her financial stability, even her future. Friends noticed Clara becoming more withdrawn. She posted less on social media, stopped attending group outings, and spoke in vague terms about feeling trapped. When asked directly if Henri was abusive, she denied it. But her eyes, tired and cautious, told a different story. The final days. On the evening of June 14, 2021, Clara attended a birthday dinner for one of her university friends. She arrived alone, smiling, but noticeably tense. Throughout the evening, her phone buzzed constantly. Friends later testified that Henri had been calling and texting her non-stop, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. At one point, Clara silenced her phone and muttered, "I'll deal with him later." It was the last time her friends saw her alive. The next morning, Clara's sister tried calling her phone. It went straight to voicemail. By evening, her parents grew worried and went to her apartment. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, and her car was parked outside. But inside, Clara was gone. Within 48 hours, the search for Clara became headline news. Posters with her photo were taped to lampposts, shared on social media, broadcast on local TV. But it was Henri's behavior that drew immediate suspicion. When police first questioned him, he claimed he hadn't seen Clara in several days. He said they were taking a break and suggested she might have gone to Paris to stay with friends. But investigators quickly uncovered surveillance footage showing Clara entering Henri's estate on the night of June 14th, footage Henri had conveniently failed to mention. 2 days later, Clara's body was found buried in a shallow grave near the edge of one of Henri's vineyards. She had been strangled. The man who once presented himself as her savior, protector, and benefactor had become her killer. A community in shock. The news shattered the town. For years, Henri had been seen as a man of prestige, wealth, and influence. He had dined with politicians, sponsored festivals, and charmed journalists. Now, he was accused of murdering the very woman he had once paraded as a symbol of his generosity. For Clara's parents, the truth was unbearable. They had warned her. They had felt something was wrong. And now, the daughter they had raised with hope and love was gone. The trial that followed would expose the full extent of Henri's manipulation, the pattern of control, the obsession with power, and the chilling belief that his wealth and influence placed him above consequences. But beneath the headlines and courtroom drama, one truth remained: Clara was young, hopeful, and trusting. Henri was older, richer, and more powerful, and that imbalance cost her life. The investigation. When Clara's body was recovered from the vineyard, the town's sense of safety was shattered. News spread rapidly, first whispered in cafes and marketplaces, then broadcast on every channel across the region. It wasn't just a homicide, it was a betrayal, a crime carried out by one of their most prominent citizens. For investigators, the case carried unique pressure. Henri LaSalle wasn't an ordinary suspect. He had money, connections, and a polished public image. If they were to bring him to justice, they would need more than suspicion. They needed undeniable proof. The first interrogation. Henri's first formal interview took place 2 days after Clara's body was found. Sitting in a crisp suit, his hair combed neatly, he presented himself as calm and cooperative. He insisted he had loved Clara, that their relationship had been complicated but affectionate. When pressed on the surveillance footage showing Clara entering his estate on June 14th, Henri stumbled. At first, he claimed the footage must have been from an earlier date. Then, he shifted, saying Clara had come to his house briefly but left after an argument. The inconsistencies were glaring. Investigators noted his pauses, the way he avoided eye contact when asked direct questions, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his glass of water. But beyond their instincts, they needed hard evidence. The estate search. The search of Henri's sprawling estate began at dawn. Police officers and forensic specialists combed through the house, the guest quarters, and the grounds. His vineyard stretched for acres, a place of beauty now tainted by horror. In the main house, investigators discovered traces of blood on a carpet near the living room sofa. Though cleaned, the faint stains were detected using luminol. Samples were collected for DNA analysis. In Henri's private study, they uncovered Clara's belongings, her handbag, her phone charger, and a necklace her sister confirmed she never took off voluntarily. Henri had told police she hadn't been at his home in days, yet her possessions were scattered in plain sight. The most damning discovery came from his vehicle. Inside the trunk of his luxury sedan, forensic experts found fibers matching Clara's jogging clothes, as well as soil consistent with the vineyard area where her body had been buried. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose around Henri's carefully crafted lies. The autopsy. Clara's autopsy revealed the brutal truth of her final moments. She had been strangled with significant force, consistent with manual pressure around the neck. Bruising on her arms suggested she had struggled fiercely, fighting for her life. There were no defensive wounds involving a weapon, which suggested Henri had used his bare hands, a chillingly intimate form of violence. The medical examiner concluded that her death was not quick. It would have taken minutes, each one filled with suffering. For Clara's family, those details were unbearable. Her father, in a statement to the press, said she trusted him. She thought he would protect her, and instead, he took everything from her. Henri's alibi collapsed. As the evidence piled up, Henri's story began to change again. He admitted Clara had been at his estate on June 14th, but claimed she had attacked him first. According to his version, she had been angry, jealous, and hysterical. He insisted he had only acted in self-defense, but forensic evidence told a different story. The bruises on Clara's body showed she had been restrained, not aggressive. The scratches on Henri's arms, examined by medical experts, were consistent with Clara clawing at him to break free, not launching an attack. Phone records further dismantled his alibi. Clara's last outgoing messages, sent just before 9:30 p.m. that night, were to a close friend. They revealed she was at Henri's house and felt uneasy, writing, "Hez in one of his moods again. If I don't text later, call me." Those words would later be read aloud in court, haunting everyone who heard them. Power and influence. What made the case even more complex was Henri's status. In a small community where he had long wielded influence, there was resistance, subtle but real, against painting him as a murderer. Some locals whispered that Clara had been ambitious, that she had played with fire by getting involved with a wealthy older man. Investigators knew these narratives could cloud the case. But the facts remained stark. Henri was the last person to see Clara alive. His estate was the crime scene, and every shred of evidence pointed toward him. Behind closed doors, officers spoke of Henri's arrogance during questioning. He seemed convinced he could talk his way out, that his reputation would shield him from accountability. But with each contradiction, his facade cracked. The vineyard grave, the shallow grave where Clara's body was found, became a critical focus of the investigation. Forensic teams analyzed the soil, documenting the layers of disturbance. They determined the grave had been dug hastily, sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. Nearby tire tracks matched Henri's vehicle, and shovel marks suggested tools taken directly from his estate. The clumsy attempt to conceal the body contrasted sharply with Henri's usual reputation for order and precision. It revealed something else, a moment of panic, desperation, and loss of control. Witnesses later reported seeing Henri's car leaving the vineyard late that night, headlights off as it crept down the dirt road. At the time, no one thought much of it. In hindsight, it was damning. Public reaction. As the investigation advanced, the public's perception of Henri shifted dramatically. The man once hailed as a benefactor was now whispered about as a monster. Newspapers ran headlines like "From Power to Prison," "The Fall of Henri LaSalle," and "The Double Life of a Vineyard Tycoon." Clara's face appeared on posters, in candlelight vigils, and on social media campaigns demanding justice. Thousands of people across the region marched in silence, holding her photo, demanding accountability, not just for Clara, but for women silenced by powerful men. For Clara's parents, the grief was crushing. They spoke little to the media, focusing instead on ensuring their daughter's story was told truthfully. Her mother, Isabel, said in one emotional statement, "My daughter was not naive. She was not greedy. She was young, hopeful, and trusting, and he used that against her." Henri's behavior in custody. Even as the walls closed in, Henri maintained his arrogance. Guards at the detention center reported that he often spoke of his friends in high places, suggesting he would be released soon. He complained about the food, the bedding, the indignity of being treated like an ordinary prisoner. But privately, he began to unravel. Interrogators noted moments when his composure broke. When confronted with the evidence, his voice cracked, his hands shook. In one session, faced with Clara's final text messages, he fell silent for nearly 2 minutes, staring at the table, before muttering, "She shouldn't have pushed me." It wasn't a confession, but it was as close as they had come toward trial. By early 2022, prosecutors had built a case that was as solid as the vineyard soil where Clara had been found. They had forensic evidence, phone records, witness testimony, and Henri's own contradictions. But they knew the trial would be brutal. Henri's wealth meant he could afford the best defense attorneys, lawyers skilled at creating doubt, spinning narratives, and manipulating perception. The prosecution prepared meticulously. They framed the case not just as a homicide, but as a story of power, control, and manipulation. They intended to show the jury how Henri's influence had hidden his darker side, how Clara's youth and vulnerability had been exploited, and how the imbalance of power between them had turned deadly. For Clara's family, the wait for trial was excruciating. Every day was a reminder of what had been taken from them. Every headline reopened wounds, but they vowed to see it through, to face Henri in court, and to demand justice for their daughter. The stage was set. The wealthy, influential man who had once seemed untouchable would now sit in the dock, forced to answer for the crime that had shocked the nation. And as the trial began, one question hung in the air. Would Henri's power and influence save him once again? Or would justice finally prevail for Clara? The trial. By the spring of 2022, the case of Henri LaSalle versus the state had grown far beyond the boundaries of one small coastal town. It was now a national story, headlining newspapers, dominating nightly broadcasts, and sparking heated debate across social media. People weren't just following a murder case, they were witnessing a reckoning. The question was no longer whether Henri had killed Clara Dubois. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether his power, money, and influence could bend the justice system in his favor. Opening statements. On the first day of the trial, the courthouse was packed. Journalists, activists, students, and ordinary citizens crowded the steps, waiting to glimpse the man at the center of it all. Henri arrived in a dark, tailored suit, escorted by lawyers who whispered constantly in his ear. His face was expressionless, but the arrogance in his posture remained. Inside, the judge called for order, and the proceedings began. The prosecution opened with stark words. This is not a story of love gone wrong. This is a story of control, of obsession, and of violence. It is the story of a man who believed that wealth and power gave him ownership of another human being. And when she tried to free herself, he silenced her forever. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward Henri. The defense, in contrast, painted a different picture. They described Henri as a man of generosity and patience, a respected businessman who had been pushed to the brink by a volatile relationship. They suggested Clara was manipulative, unfaithful, and emotionally unstable. Their strategy was clear: tarnish Clara's reputation, muddy the waters, and argue for reduced culpability. Evidence laid bare. Over the following weeks, prosecutors methodically dismantled Henri's carefully built image. Forensic experts testified about the bloodstains found on Henri's carpet, traces that matched Clara's DNA. They described the bruises on her body, the marks of strangulation, and the fibers in his car trunk that tied directly to her clothing. Digital analysts presented phone records. Clara's final text messages, sent from Henri's estate, revealed her growing fear. They read, as in one of his moods again, "If I don't text later, call me." The silence that followed those words painted a chilling picture. Surveillance footage showed Clara entering Henri's home on the night of June 14th. She never left. The jury sat in silence as the evidence was laid out piece by piece, building a picture of premeditated violence and deliberate concealment. Henri's defense. Henri's lawyers fought fiercely. They claimed the forensic evidence was circumstantial, that the bloodstains could have come from a minor injury Clara suffered days earlier, that fibers in the trunk were explained by her frequent use of his car. They argued that Clara's final texts reflected not fear, but the drama of a young woman in an emotional relationship. When it came to Henri's own testimony, the defense made a calculated risk. Against common advice, Henri took the stand. Henri speaks. When Henri began speaking, the courtroom leaned forward. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He described himself as a man deeply in love with Clara, who had been patient with her youthful temper. He admitted they had argued that night, but insisted he had never meant to hurt her. According to him, Clara had become aggressive, throwing objects, shouting insults, and even striking him. He claimed he restrained her to protect himself, and that in the struggle, she accidentally stopped breathing. The courtroom was tense. Some jurors avoided eye contact, others scribbled notes furiously. But under cross-examination, Henri's calm began to unravel. The prosecutor pressed him on why, if Clara's death had been an accident, he had buried her in a shallow grave, why he had attempted to burn her body, why he had lied to police about the last time he had seen her. Henri's answers faltered. He muttered about panic, about confusion, about being afraid people would misunderstand. His composure slipped, and for the first time, the mask cracked. The jury saw not a grieving lover, but a man desperately trying to rewrite the truth. Clara's family testifies. One of the most emotional moments came when Clara's family took the stand. Her mother, Isabel, described her daughter as bright, ambitious, and trusting. She spoke of Clara's love for music, her dreams of moving to the city, and her kindness toward everyone she met. Her father's testimony was even more devastating. Voice trembling, he recalled warning Clara about Henri's controlling behavior. I told her, power like his doesn't come without a price. But she believed in people. Even when she shouldn't have, she believed in him. The jury watched in silence as tears ran down his face. Public reaction. Outside the courthouse, protests grew louder with each passing day. Feminist groups held banners reading, "Justice for Clara" and "No More Silence." Candlelight vigils were held nightly, with hundreds gathering to honor Clara's memory. Social media erupted with outrage as details of Henri's defense circulated. Many saw it as a familiar pattern. Powerful men discrediting their victims, shifting blame, and relying on influence to escape justice. The case had become more than a trial. It was a symbol, a test of whether the system could stand against wealth and power. The closing arguments. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. The prosecution's closing argument was clear and piercing. This was not a man pushed into a moment of madness. This was a man who believed he owned a woman. He silenced her when she resisted, and he tried to erase her existence. The evidence is undeniable. Do not let his wealth, his influence, or his arrogance blind you to the truth. Clara deserves justice. The defense countered by insisting Henri was guilty of manslaughter, not murder. They argued for reduced sentencing, claiming he had acted in the heat of passion, overwhelmed by emotion. The jury retired to deliberate, waiting for the verdict. For Clara's family, the hours of waiting felt like years. They sat in silence, clutching photos of their daughter, bracing for whatever the future held. Outside, the crowd swelled. Reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens waiting anxiously. After 11 hours, the jury returned. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. The room fell silent, and when the words were spoken, they would determine whether justice had finally pierced the shield of wealth and power, whether Clara's story would become another tragedy lost in the shadow of influence. The verdict. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions grave. 11 hours of deliberation had passed, but for Clara's family, it felt like an eternity. Every shuffle of paper, every creak of the wooden benches seemed to echo louder than usual. Henri sat stiffly, his expensive suit immaculate, his eyes fixed forward. He exuded the same cold arrogance he had displayed since the beginning, as though still believing his influence would tip the scales. Behind him, his legal team whispered last-minute reassurances. But the room itself felt different now, heavy, expectant. The foreman of the jury stood, holding the verdict slip in trembling hands. The judge asked for silence. Every breath seemed to stop. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Henri LaSalle, guilty of murder in the first degree." The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a wave of emotion rippled across the room. Clara's mother broke down, clutching her husband's arm as tears streamed down her face. Her father bowed his head, whispering something no one else could hear. Activists in the gallery let out muffled gasps, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Henri did not flinch. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as though refusing to accept that the verdict applied to him. Sentencing. 2 weeks later, the court reconvened for sentencing. By then, Henri's reputation had already crumbled. His businesses were collapsing, investors fleeing, and his once loyal allies retreating into silence. The image of a respected tycoon was gone, replaced by that of a murderer. The prosecution demanded life imprisonment, citing not only the brutality of Clara's death, but also the deliberate attempts to conceal it. The burial, the lies, the manipulation. Henri's defense pleaded for leniency. They argued that he had acted in a moment of passion, not with premeditation, and that a lengthy sentence would serve no purpose. But their words fell flat. When the judge delivered the sentence, the courtroom once again fell silent. For the crime of murder in the first degree, aggravated by abuse of trust and attempted concealment, this court sentences you, Henri LaSalle, to life imprisonment with a minimum of 30 years before eligibility for parole. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Clara's family held each other, overwhelmed with both grief and relief. The man who had taken their daughter's life would now spend the rest of his behind bars. Henri showed no visible reaction. He stood, nodded once at his lawyers, and was escorted away in handcuffs. For the first time, his wealth and influence had failed him. Aftermath. The verdict sent shockwaves across the country. For weeks it dominated headlines. Tycoon falls, Henri LaSalle sentenced for murder. The case sparked debates about power, privilege, and the silent dangers of relationships built on imbalance. For Clara's friends and family, the legal victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it could not bring her back. Her mother later said in an interview, "We don't celebrate this. How could we? "We lost our daughter. All we wanted was truth. And now the truth is known." Her father echoed the sentiment. The verdict doesn't heal the wound, but at least it stops him from hurting anyone else. Across the small coastal town where Clara had grown up, her memory became a rallying cry. Vigils were held, schools organized talks on healthy relationships, and community leaders pushed for stronger protections for women vulnerable to coercion and control. Clara's face, once smiling in photographs, now appeared on posters alongside slogans demanding change. Henri behind bars. In prison, Henri struggled to adjust. Guards reported that he remained aloof, often isolated,